excited to stand with you and celebrate local boy William O. Douglas and the lives of the stories he's inspired. With that, we've got the Yakima Warriors Association, and I would ask everybody to rise. I'm going to begin by introducing the crew. They're led by head warrior Vic Wood, who served in the U.S. Navy on the USS Midway. On trumpet, we've got Toppanish's very own Lauren Corpus, served in the Marines. Accompanying him on drum, John Smith, who served in the Army, the Marines, and the Navy. Please welcome the color guard of the Yakima Warriors Association, who will play for us a rendition of the national anthem. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, members of the Yakima Warriors Association. The Yakima Warriors are all veterans who've served in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Many of the members are enrolled members of the Yakima Nation, but their membership has expanded, and now they're a tribe all their own. So I thank them for their service and for their contributions tonight. I'd now like to ask for a moment of collected gratitude and acknowledgement that we are gathered here today on the ancestral lands of the 14 confederated tribes and bands of the Yakima Nation. The Yakimas lived and thrived on more than 12 million acres of land here in central Washington, including much, if not all, of what we now know as Adams, Benton, Chelan, Douglas, Kittitas, Franklin, Klickitat, and of course Yakima counties. The Yakima Valley Museum, this convention center, and most of the homes that many of us live in are on land that was ceded by the Yakima Nation in the Treaty of 1855. Lands that were ceded in exchange for solemn promises of peace and of sovereignty, promises of self-governance, preservation of culture, tradition, and identity forever. All of that at the barrel of a gun. So before we begin, let us honor and offer gratitude in word today, and as we go forth in deed, to the Yakima people who've lived here since time immemorial, the Yakima people who are tied to this land forever and today remain committed stewards, cherishing and protecting the land, their customs and traditions, and their solemn and sacred rights as guided by the words and deeds of their elders. Speaking of elders, we have one here tonight, and I have the privilege and honor of inviting up to the stage to offer a traditional Yakima blessing, one of the tribal elders of the Yakima Nation, a man I know, a man I greatly respect and admire, Davis Yellowash Washines. Before he takes the stage, I have some thoughts I'd like to share with you about Yellowash. Yellowash was born in 1951 along the banks of the Nichiwana, or the Great River, known to many of us now as the Columbia River. During his childhood, Yellowash was sent to boarding school at the Riverside Indian School in Anadarko, Oklahoma. Now, I'm told he was quite a basketball player. But at Riverside, it was a place where speaking his native language and expressing his traditional beliefs is something that was met with severe punishment. Yellowash returned to the Yakima Nation in his 20s, and his contributions to tribal culture and tribal governance are just immeasurable. He began his public service in 1973 with the Yakima Tribal Police Department, and he advanced through the ranks to police chief, first from 1986 to 1996, and again from 2005 to 2008. In between those stints, he served on the Yakima Tribal Council, and if you think serving as a police chief and serving on tribal council, if you think that's tough duty, ask him about his time as a middle school counselor on the reservation. In 2010, Yellowash was appointed chief of police for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. He was elected Yakima Nation General Council chairman in December of 2014, and that's where I met him. I remember sitting there in a chair in council chambers at the tip of the spear, very uncomfortable, and I remember his reassuring words and his signature chuckle. Yellowash today is revered as a spiritual leader with the Yakima Nation. He moves seamlessly between the Sadist Shaker Church and the Washout religion and the Longhouses. He's taught the Yakima language, Sahaptin, at local schools. One of his proudest achievements is when, as Yakima police chief, he led the effort to restore the original spelling of the name Yakima to how it appeared in the Yakima Treaty of 1855. I've stood with Yellowash on the steps of the Washington State Supreme Court in Olympia. I've heard him sing in the halls of the United States Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., where the marshal threatened to kick him out unless he stopped that traditional nonsense. I've had the honor and privilege of watching him fight fearlessly and relentlessly for the rights of the Yakimas and for indigenous peoples everywhere. This man represents, to me, so much of what it means to be from here. Yellowash, the stage is yours.
Before we begin the meal, we have a word in our language that speaks to the water. Water is life, takes care of everything. We tell our young people that in the beginning, when our people were put here, that the water had taken on that responsibility, that job to take care of us. Not only us humans, but also everything, the animals, the plants, the medicines, the trees. And the job that it took, even to us as individuals, in our tears, when we release our emotions, whether it's sometimes a sad occasion or even a happy occasion. That is the job that it carries today, and so we recognize that before every meal, we take a sip of our water as a testimony to that responsibility that the church has for us. And these are the things that we pass on to our children, grandchildren, even those yet unborn. So with that explanation, will you join with me in however you believe, whatever denomination, whatever faith you carry? We're going to humble ourselves before our Creator before we take our meal, the sustenance of our life. In our way, it's a medicine, especially when somebody invites you to your home and you give them something to eat or drink. That's a big teaching to us. So at this time, we're all going to join together in prayer in whatever way you believe. And I'm going to speak in my language because I want the Creator to hear directly from me the language that He gave to our people when we were put here. So at this time, we'll humble ourselves to the Creator. Chinarkwi koi an, kuchna neat, and a kush kotanawashat, yanawit ichinyo nichyo, and a kushna maatona na kushna nam aiken, inch e mimi iwacha winch, iwanikshana William O. Douglas, kaawacha na kush pamink, kutkut, and a ku inaknui shana timani tamanwich nati chamna. Kuchikuk and a kushna chiman, Yanawisha ichinyao nichao, and a kush quatanawasha chi and a kush qui, and a kushnam the wheatkan, klach iwineta ichinyao, and a kanana kushna mimi, and a kush pakuchana, pataimuchana timiwai na yanawita, gonna pashtaimata, nine abutam ta quaratiao, and a squanana kushnas twana chikuk, and a kush and takonawasha klach. Chi imiwai napti tikta to winch kutilaki and a kwana na kushna shinawa titi maman and a kuna naimo and a papa naimusha itching out kwaratio watwi and a kuchush and a kushi tutisha chush and a kushi naknuisha klachmaman and a kwana na kushna sha twana chikuk and a kutanawata chiman kwana na kushnam na wheatkan na kinu kwadash and a klauikushnai. So when I say choosh, everybody take a drink of water. Choosh. You're following a custom, a tradition that has been here since our people have been here. So, and that is the way that we take care of one another. Thank you.
I hope everyone enjoyed their meal. Can we have a round of applause for all the staff? The folks who put the food on the table, folks who served it, folks who cleaned it, our friends in the audio visual, and just for the Convention Center for being such gracious and complete hosts. Thanks so much. So next up, we are going to recognize and honor the winners of the museum's essay contest. And I'd like to invite up to the stage Museum Executive Director Peter Arnold and Washington State Supreme Court Justice Deborah Stevens. Justice Stevens, you may know, is the first woman from Eastern Washington and the first judge from the Eastern Washington's Division III Court of Appeals to serve on the Washington State Supreme Court. She's served there for almost 15 years now, and as someone who has stood at the podium in front of her, I can promise you two things. She will read everything you give her, and she will think of questions that have not yet occurred to you. Peter Arnold was born in what was then known as Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. He received a law degree from the University of Rhodesia. He served in the Rhodesian military, and he worked as a district attorney in the Rhodesian government. My favorite story is that after his service in Rhodesia, he moved to South Africa, where he became a crocodile farmer. And he tells me that those are actually the exact same skills you need as practicing law. Received his Master's of Museum Studies in 2002. He's been the executive director of the Yakima Valley Museum since 2017. I'm really excited to introduce Mr. Arnold and Supreme Court Justice Stevens.
Well, we have one of the delightful duties of the evening. As part of this celebration of the legacy of Justice William O. Douglas, we sponsored an essay competition. There was a high school division and a college division. And it's our pleasure this evening to present, to recognize the winners in the high school division and the college division, and to present them each with a $1,000 scholarship for their efforts. But we're going to tell you a little bit about each of them. First, I'm going to introduce Isabel Ellis, who is the high school winner. Isabel, you want to come on up, and I'll say a little bit about you. Thank you. Isabel is in 11th, she's a junior at Davis High School, and the title of her essay was A People for the Planet, highlighting the environmental stewardship that Justice Douglas is so known for. And let me just quote a passage from her essay. She wrote, "Often, people will say not everything can be fixed, that the odds are too great, too insurmountable. In reality, nothing is unachievable when we come together and stand on an even field." So true. Congratulations, Isabel. Oh, here we come. Okay, here, you want to hold the certificate? Why don't we have her come in between? Yep. Are we okay right here, or do you need us to move over? And in the college division, we have, and Kali, I'm going to get your name right, Kali Natarajan, who is a senior at Whitman College. I learned in having dinner with Kali that we're both, daughters of Spokane, so she grew up in Liberty Lake area. The title of her essay was The Rationality, Risk, and Reward of Public Land. And let me just share a quote from her essay. "Not all public land should be available for human use, and where needed, land should be used as a preservation to maintain the integrity of fragile and at-risk ecosystems." And by the way, both of these essays are available on the museum's website, and I think also social media, and I really commend them to you. They're excellent explorations. Callie is studying environmental studies and economics at Whitman. She does have an interest in law school, so I think many in this room may be encouraging her in that direction. So Callie, please come up. Congratulations. So anything else we need to do? All right, so thank you very much, and thanks also to the generous sponsors who helped with the scholarships for the essay competition. Thank you.
So we're winding up to the big event. We are going to be presenting the inaugural award to Secretary Jewell. To set the stage for that, we have a recorded message from Cathy Douglas Stone. Cathy Douglas Stone has a Bachelor of Arts and a Juris Doctorate from American University. She has a Master of Laws from Georgetown University Law Center. She was Boston's first Chief of Environmental Services. She served on the boards of a wide range of environmental causes, including the Board of the Wilderness Society, the Nature Conservancy. She served on the Supreme Court Historical Society, and of course, my favorite, National Public Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, by video, Cathy Douglas Stone.
I am honored to be with you today to present the inaugural William O. Douglas Award to an extraordinary advocate for our nation's natural and cultural treasures, Secretary Sally Jewell. My late husband Bill would have been pleased to see the Yakima Museum bestowing this award on such a deserving public servant. Both Bill and Secretary Jewell grew up in the soil of the Pacific Northwest, steeped in the values of environmental sustainability. As you know, Bill was an avid outdoorsman and passionate about conserving our nation's lands and waters. He brought this passion with him to the United States Supreme Court, and he played an important role in preserving and defending such notable places as the C&O Canal in Washington, the Olympic Peninsula, the Red River Gorge in Kentucky, and his beloved Cascade Range, and many more places. Secretary Jewell is truly a kindred spirit. Just like Bill, she's been a lifelong outdoors enthusiast. She's a hiker, a skier, a climber, a paddler. And prior to her work in Washington, she spent 17 years at various roles in the REI Co-op, including as president and CEO. She is currently serving as the Fritzsche Chair in Leadership at the University of Washington's Foster School of Business, where she helps students and faculty apply their skills to help create a more sustainable world. Over the years, Secretary Jewell has received widespread recognition for her public service, including the University of Washington's highest alumni honor, Alumni Summa Laude Dignata, the Director of the Year Award from the National Association of Corporate Directors for her nonprofit service, and the Rachel Carson Award from the Audubon Society. She continues to serve actively with several organizations, including the Nature Conservancy, for which she served as interim CEO for 2019 and 20, the Aspen Institute Center for Native American Youth, Earth Lab at the University of Washington, and many others. She also serves on several corporate boards, including Costco, Symetra, and Green Diamond Resources. Just like Bill, Secretary Jewell brought her passion for the outdoors, her idealism, and her pragmatism to work in Washington. Appointed Secretary of the Interior by President Obama, she served in this role from 2013 to 2017. And during her tenure, she oversaw the nation's national parks, wildlife refuges, and other public lands. But the job of the Secretary is not just to oversee these precious resources, but it's to champion them. Secretary Jewell did precisely that. By using landscape-level collaborative approach, Secretary Jewell and her team were able to help President Obama protect more land and waters than any president in United States history. Included in her many accomplishments is the protection of the Oregon Mountain Desert Peaks as a national monument in New Mexico, the protection of the Soneta public lands as a national monument in California, the establishment of over 45,000 acres of national wildlife refuges, like the Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge in New Mexico, the cancellation of the Solanex oil and gas leases in the Badger 2 Medicine area of Montana's Rocky Mountain front, a secretarial order to increase access to the outdoors for the underserved youth, which she named after the wonderful Seattle conservationist Doug Walker, the designation of Bears Ears National Monument in Utah, and the Gold Butte National Monument in Nevada. The courageous decision to block the construction of a road through the Ismabec National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, a problem I am still personally working on, and many, many other places. Part of Secretary Jewell's success, I believe, stems from her strong belief in bringing people with diverse backgrounds and priorities together to pursue a common goal. Throughout her tenure, Secretary Jewell was deeply committed to rebuilding trust with indigenous peoples by developing nation-to-nation relationships with tribes across the United States. She also knew that it was vital to recognize the importance of a robust economy and actively supported the development of commercial-scale, renewable energy on public lands and waters. Secretary Jewell embodies the precise qualities we need today in our leaders. And I say this from personal experience, as I've served on the board of the Wilderness Society for many years, including the years Secretary Jewell's tenure. I have seen firsthand her commitment, wisdom, and passion, but also her ability to identify common ground and move beyond the sound bites to understand diverse points of view. She brings a true spirit of partnership to all she undertakes, and this is why it is so fitting to award the very first William O. Douglas Award to Secretary Sally Jewell, who has made extraordinary advances in precisely the causes my late husband so deeply cared about. Congratulations, Secretary Jewell, and thank you for all you've done for our country.
So for the presentation of the award itself, I'd like to invite Karen Wells and Secretary Sally Jewell to the stage. Karen Wells walks this earth as Justice Douglas's granddaughter. She was born in England, moved to the United States in 1981 when she was 5, 6? Yeah. She spent many summers with Grandpa Bill in the cabins he built in the Goose Prairie in eastern Oregon. She's got some stories she'd like to share with us tonight about her relationship and her memories of Grandpa. I had the opportunity to meet last night with Secretary Sally Jewell, and my overwhelming takeaway was just, holy cow, she's like a superhero. I kept waiting for her to have a cape fly behind her. And I was reflecting on how lucky we are as Americans that people of her skill set, her intelligence, her creativity, her accomplishments, her cultural fluency, people like that are still willing to serve as public servants. And when President Obama asked her to become the Secretary of the Interior, and she said yes, I mean, that's a decision that literally has made the world a better place. And then if it wasn't possible for her to be more cool in my eyes, a kid from Toppenish, I learned yesterday that she makes annual trips to the Lower Valley just to get tacos and tamales at the El Ranchito. So I present to you Karen Wells and Secretary Sally Jewell.
Good evening. What a great video introduction by Cathy Douglas-Stone, and I'm sorry that she and her husband Jim couldn't be here to enjoy the award banquet with us. Secretary Jewell, you're a very accomplished individual, and thank you for all your hard work that you are doing to protect our lands and the environment and wildlife. It's apparent that you and my grandfather passions professionally and personally align when it comes to causes related to protecting the environment. It was Grandpa Bill who introduced me to the mountains and the wilderness in the US at a very young age. I was born and raised in the UK, and my first time to the States was when I was 2 years old. And after that, we visited the US almost every other year. Okay. Every year for our summer holidays. And how lucky could a kid be? On these visits, we either spent time visiting Grandpa Bill at Goose Prairie or at the cabins in the Yellowash that he built in the 1930s. These cabins are by the Lostine River that has recently been designated a scenic river, and it is beautiful. Today, my cousin and I are stewards of the cabins, and our families continue to enjoy them, and we take great care to preserve surrounding wilderness, which Grandpa Bill would have liked for our family's future generations. My personal relationship with my grandfather was all about being outdoors. I remember him in some of the photos shown here and on the invitation. For me, he was sitting on a horse, wearing a cowboy hat, jeans, boots, spurs, and he often has a piece of grass, chewing on a piece of grass in his mouth. In my mind, as from England, he was a cowboy. He also was regularly found standing waist-high in the water fly fishing, though without his boots and spurs. His love for the outdoors was obvious to anyone who knew him. If he wasn't outdoors, he was in his office, and I was told not to disturb him on any accounts because he was busy writing for hours and hours. And as a kid, I didn't believe anyone could be writing all day and well into the evening. It wasn't until I was an adult and much older, I knew he did just that. His Washington, D.C. life didn't exist for me until I was a young adult. Grandpa Bill gave me my love for the mountains and the wilderness, my love for horses. He took me to my first Chief Joseph days and my first rodeo in Pendleton. The wilderness is a sanctuary for me and many others. Protecting our lands and waters from highways and thoroughfares and keeping our national parks pristine is such an important task, balancing between allowing visitors to enjoy these public areas and keeping the environmental protection and sustainability going for future generations to enjoy is what you've been striving to do. So Grandpa Bill would be honored that Secretary Jewell is continuing his legacy and is the first recipient of this award. And if Grandpa was here today, he would be proud, as I am, to present this very heavy award to Secretary Jewell, the William O. Douglas Award on behalf of the Yakima Museum. And I don't know if you guys can see what it says. I can read it.
Can you read it?
Yeah, I got it here. The
That will
William O.
be easier.
Douglas Award presented to the Honorable Sally Jewell for her outstanding contributions to the conservation of the nation's irreplaceable natural, cultural, and historic treasures, and in doing, continuing the legacy and values espoused by Associate Justice William O. Douglas, August 13th, 2022, Yakima Museum.
Lovely.
Oh, yeah.
We have to have our picture. I have no idea how I can live up to all these comments. My husband is busy saying, "Who is this person?" Anyway, thank you, Karen, for the amazing award. It is certainly the heaviest award I've ever received. But it's great that it is a piece of basalt. That just says so much about Yakima and our state and its early formations, and really speaks to me. So thank you very much. Also, Brendan, I have heard many land acknowledgements. I had one prepared, and that was superb, and I hope it lived up to Davis and Carmen and our Yakima Warriors' expectations, but well done. I won't need to do it, but it is too rare at public events, and I'm delighted that it is important. I'm delighted that it was recognized as important at this event, and I hope it becomes the norm everywhere. I also want to say I know I'm in a room with a lot of lawyers. Judges, justices, and I really learned to love lawyers when I was in Washington, D.C. I was sued on average 3 times a week, and and I was never so happy, and neither was Warren Jewell, my husband, when I left office and they all went to V. Zinke. As I was not unhappy to leave those. But I do want to say I do appreciate and value the importance of policy and the importance of our justice system and our courts in holding ourselves accountable. So thank you for your good work as lawyers and judges and so on. I also would like to say a word about something that Brendan mentioned on the front end, and that is public servants. If I could just have people raise their hands if you have served the public at any level, not just federal, state, tribal, local, municipal, county. If you've served the public, could you just raise your hands? Could we give all of these people a huge round of applause? It is difficult to be a public servant. Why? I guess so darn easy to run a business compared to being a public servant. And I could go into all the reasons why, but let's just say business CEOs are valued and public servants are often vilified, and it really should be the other way around. Not that I mean to put down any of the business leaders in the audience, that's my profession, but thank you. I also want to give my thanks to the selection committee that picked me for this award, led by Cathy Douglas-Stone, and it's a little bit embarrassing that she knows so much about me. She gave me credit for a lot of things that, as you know, as a high-level public servant, you don't do the work. Thousands of people literally do the work, so I appreciate that. And I appreciate her colleague, Clemence, who's here to represent her, we've had an enjoyable time getting to know them. For Karen and Glenn to bring the Douglas family directly into this is special, and I'm sure he was a wonderful grandfather and a complicated individual. And I learned about that from a person you're going to hear from soon, the Honorable Margaret McKeown, who I've known for some years, not terribly well, but I got to know her a lot better by reading the book that she has just written that's for sale out there, and I encourage you, it's very well written, and it's not too long, which is always important for me. She helped me understand the conservation legacy of William O. Douglas, a conservation legacy that was far more important to me than I knew. Even in my time as Secretary of the Interior. Margaret, like Justice Douglas, is a champion for the environment, an enjoyer of the environment, and also a champion for upholding the rule of law. And I deeply appreciate her contributions. I had a chance today to go out to the museum. I want to thank Peter Arnold and all of the staff at the Yakima Valley Museum for putting on this event, but also for helping the world understand the things that have happened within the Yakima Valley, things that have happened geologically, culturally, going back to the original stewards of these landscapes, the settlers and their influence, the amount of reliance that we have on the agriculture that is so prevalent in these fertile valleys. And so thank you for the work of the museum. And having met the curators and the staff there, they are continually improving it. So I encourage you to visit early and often and support the museum through your work. So I just gave a speech a few weeks ago on a stage at 10:45 in the morning called the Chautauqua Institution, which is the place that just yesterday Salman Rushdie was attacked in an assassination attempt. And I just mention that because I think speaking is important, and the Chautauqua Institution, there was a Wall Street Journal editorial or comment about it yesterday. It's an innocent place. It's a place where speech is valued, where differences of opinion are valued, where differences of religion are valued. And so obviously we all hope that Mr. Rushdie survives this attack, but it can't dissuade us from speaking up and speaking out. So the title of my talk there was America's Public Lands, Fuel Our Soul, Unlock Our Curiosity, and Connect Us to Nature. We are blessed to live in this country where the best places were not set aside for the kings and queens or nobility, but remain there generally for the public, all of us. When the lands of our continent were colonized, and my ancestors were part of that, even though I'm an immigrant myself, the concept of private property was a foreign one. The indigenous people of our nation, American Indians, like the confederated tribes and bands of the Yakima Nation, the Alaska Natives, the Native Hawaiians, already knew how to live as part of nature, not nature to be conquered, how to sustain resources, and how to move around as needed to ensure nature's bounty. Well, with settlement came unsustainable exploitation of many of our resources in the name of economic progress. We've all benefited from that. President Lincoln was called to protect Yosemite Valley from development. Later, President Teddy Roosevelt and some of his closest advisors, Stephen Mather, Gifford Pinchot, which is a name very familiar to us in this region, helped formalize and popularize the protection of land and the preservation of cultural resources, reducing, not eliminating, but reducing their commercial exploitation. And in the words of Justice Douglas, who deeply appreciated these natural treasures, we inherited the loveliest of all continents. We should bequeath it to our grandchildren as a land where the majority is disciplined to respect the values even of a minority. Justice Douglas's childhood, as we've heard, was shaped by this place, the Yakima Valley and the surrounding mountains and hillsides, a beautiful place. They built his strength physically and emotionally and provided the motivation to advocate for America's public lands. And like Teddy Roosevelt, when he needed to heal, Justice Douglas sought nature. In his case, Goose Prairie in the mountains east of here, and in the Yellowash, it sounds like, having listened to Karen. For Teddy Roosevelt, he went to the Dakota Territory. He lost his wife and his mother on the same day. It was a Valentine's Day, and went to the Dakota Territory to heal. So when my family immigrated from England in 1959, my father asked his colleagues at the University of Washington, "What do people do around here?" And he was told, they camped, and they hiked, and they bought their gear from this little cooperative above the Green Apple Pie Market on Pike Street called REI. So my dad was member number 17249. I think only one of you tonight has greeted me with your member number, but I know many of you know them, at least the older folks in the group. So the natural world here shaped me, and the changes that I have seen across our state over the course of my 66 years helped me understand that we can't take these places for granted. We used to come as a family regularly over to Potholes Reservoir near Moses Lake. I used to love to just run up and jump off the sand dunes. Anybody do that? They're not there anymore. I took my kids, I talked it up, I said, oh, we're gonna go jump off some big sand dunes, and they're not there anymore. I mean, they're there under the vegetation. The old growth trees that I enjoyed in some of the forests were no longer there. But the clear cuts that were so obvious along I-90 are disappearing because those lands are being brought back. And they're being brought back because we understand the importance of connected ecosystems. We're learning, we're growing, and nature knows how to heal. A daughter of Yakima also shaped my path. The co-founder of REI, Mary Anderson, was born Mary Geyser here in 1909. She died at 107 in 2017. Like Douglas, she contracted polio as a child and was told she may never walk. She was in an iron lung like the one on display, maybe the one that's on display, I don't know, at the Yakima Valley Museum. And her mother really nursed her back to health, and she found the mountains, like Justice Douglas, and they gave her physical and emotional strength. And Mary and her husband Lloyd founded REI in 1938 as a cooperative to help others enjoy the outdoors. Justice Douglas, in his work, gave standing to those with no voice. Yes, he was a champion for the underserved and the underrepresented, but also for the rivers, the trees, the animals, the ecosystems, the things that we heard from Yellowash in his blessing. He was a true environmentalist down to his core. He shaped policy and practice through his writings, whether they were writings of the court or they were his prolific writings otherwise. And he recognized that nature and the outdoors needed protections from the powerful so they would be there for everyone. As Secretary of the Interior, I quickly realized, as I mentioned earlier, that being a public servant was different from running a business. It meant your customer was everyone. The far left, the far right, the downtrodden, the wealthy, but not just the people of today, the future generations. And I said to my team weeks into the job, I now get this. I'm in the forever business, the forever business. And I now realize how much I benefited from the groundwork Justice Douglas laid in shaping policy through his work in a way where I could make smart choices that would impact not just now, but generations to come. His advocacy, not his direct work, because laws are made by lawmakers and he was not a lawmaker, but he helped shape or uphold what we now consider bedrock environmental laws, which Margaret can talk far more eloquently than I ever could. But the National Environmental Policy Act and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. And we did not have clean water and clean air. These are things we take for granted. My husband, 44 years, my first husband, and my only, there's one difference from Justice Douglas. I got off at a tangent. I don't even remember what I was going to say. Oh, well. Anyway, he created bedrock environmental laws that are so important, and some of those laws continue to be challenged. After President Obama left office and I left my job in government, the Antiquities Act, which was enacted with Teddy Roosevelt in 1906, was undermined for the first time, I think, in its history by overturning decisions by prior presidents to national monuments. One had been around for over 20 years. Efforts to prioritize economic interests over environmental interests constantly threaten our natural world and our cultural history, just as they have for years. So ensuring that our laws remain in place and our legal system upholds the intent of these laws is a never-ending journey. And I know that the lawyers in the room and certainly the judges in the room will understand that. We live in a polarized time. People are more focused on differences than on commonalities. Although, as I've said to some people that I've spoken with, I worked very closely with people from all different political ideologies in the job, and they may not want to be seen with you, but they will meet you behind the scenes, and together you will get an incredible amount done. And I believe in human nature, and I believe we can do that. And I think nature is one thing that brings us together across ideologies. And I saw this at Interior, collaborating with people of all political persuasions, united in support of the natural places that are special to each of them, just as these places we've heard about were special to Justice Douglas. So this is a journey I suspect that has no end, but Justice Douglas helped shape our path. And whether he recognized it or not, he was following a path shaped by the indigenous people of this country that have understood this since time immemorial. So I'm very proud to be the recipient of this award in his name. And I want to provide a huge thanks to the Yakima Valley Museum and the selection committee and the supporters of the museum for this recognition, but more importantly, for bringing all of us together to appreciate the legacy of the late Justice William O. Douglas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Secretary Jewell. Such inspiring words, again, gives the people in this room hope for what the future may look like. Okay, our final speaker, the keynote address, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Margaret McKeown. Judge McKeown is, by any measure, an absolute pioneer in the legal profession. She graduated from Georgetown Law Center and then became the first ever female law partner at the international juggernaut firm Perkins Coie. Started out in Seattle and then went single-handedly and opened up the office in Washington, D.C. She was appointed by President Clinton to the Ninth Circuit in 1998. If I were going to list all of her accomplishments and awards, we'd be here until Tuesday. So I'm just going to give the highlights. She's the recipient of the Margaret Brent Award, recognizing outstanding women lawyers who've achieved excellence and paved the way for other women in the profession. She's a recipient of the John Marshall Award, reserved for those who've had a positive national impact on the justice system. She's a recipient of the Inns of Court Professionalism Award for the Ninth Circuit. Among my favorites, an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's been the president of the Federal Judges Association, the chair of the American Bar Association's Federal Judicial Improvements Committee, where she was instrumental in helping the Ninth Circuit figure out how to make cases available to the public in a timely manner. She was appointed by Chief Justice Roberts to lead the Ninth Circuit Task Force on the Workplace in the opening months of the Me Too movement. She was the chair of the ABA Rule of Law Initiative, the Latin American Council, the Federal Codes of Conduct Committee. She helped create the Model Code of Judicial Conduct. Do we have a Code of Judicial Conduct for the Supreme Court yet, Judge? All right. And did I mention she's an author? I got to see yesterday for the first time Judge McKeown as she held the book in her hand, Citizen Justice. It was really beautiful to see. I know you're proud of it. I've not had a chance to read it. Everyone I've talked to who has says it's engaging, it's concise, it is gripping, and just a beautiful exploration of the environmental legacy of William O. Douglas. I'm told that if you're nice, at the conclusion of tonight, she'll sign a copy for you out front in the lobby. We've got books for sale. Judge Margaret McKeown is poised to go senior status in the coming months. And as I look out, I did notice that the trial judge who's going to replace her, Salvador Mendoza, is here. No pressure, Judge. Not big shoes to fill at all. And there we have it. I introduce to you and ask you to help me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Judge and author Margaret McKeown.
Well, good evening, and thank you for that amazing introduction. I don't know if he's brown-nosing a little and he has a case pending in the Ninth Circuit or not, but I have your last name at this point. So I do want to really thank the Yakima Valley Museum for bringing this celebration together, and it's so fitting that we're here in Yakima, a place that meant so much to Justice Douglas and the location of the William O. Douglas Courthouse. So it means a lot for all of us to be here. And listening to those excerpts from our amazing essay winners, those could have been written by Justice Douglas, and they reflect so much of who he is and what he hoped would be his legacy. So when we think about legal scholarship, we usually think about judicial role of judges. But I want to suggest to you that there's a much larger story, and that is justices as public figures. So I have to say, I literally stumbled into this topic. And here we are in Murie Ranch. This is in my home state of Wyoming, Grand Teton National Park. And I wanted to have my lunch somewhere, and you could see there wasn't many place to sit down. So I was surveying the land when a guy walked out, and I said, "Where am I?" Because I didn't know this homestead. He said, "You are at the Murie Ranch." And I said, "Oh yeah, I know that, John Muir." And he said, "No, Murie. Olaus and Margaret Murie." Olaus was a world-famous biologist. This was the conservation's home because he was the director of the Wilderness Society. And his wife, Marty, was a naturalist and an author. She died at 101. So then I got interested, and later somebody showed me this letter from William O. Douglas to Marty Murie. And he proposed, somewhat forwardly, that they should give their homestead to the National Park Service and turn it into some kind of a sanctuary. Well, in fact, that's what's happened. Whoops. And there you have it now. That's the Murie Ranch, part of the Teton Science School, where I'm on the board out in Jackson, Wyoming. And this really began this friendship with Douglas and the Muries. So my question was, who is this guy? Of course, he was a hero to many of us who went to law school in the 60s and 70s. But I was trying to figure out how these humble conservationists from Wyoming became friends with this larger-than-life Justice Douglas? Well, as it turns out, they're all Westerners, they're all connected to the land, and they were all vitally committed to conservation advocacy. So what for me began as a lark has turned into this book about their friendship and about wilderness politics. Now, we already know that Douglas was a larger-than-life and really a very public justice. He was both fascinating and flawed, no doubt. And of course, he's often remembered for his 4 wives, his impeachment inquiry, unsuccessful, I should add, and also his tenure as the longest-serving justice, more than 36 years, 1939 to 1975. So we're all familiar with many of his landmark decisions: privacy, free speech, and criminal procedure. But what I want to suggest to you that perhaps his most enduring legacy was as a successful advocate for the environment. He was a citizen justice in the truest manner. He was also an unusual justice, and he definitely lived life on the edge. He pushed the envelope ethically, personally, and judicially. So I want to explore how he did that. Well, let me set the stage. You know, who was William O. Douglas? We've heard about him. Many of you know about him. You have to visit the museum to know even more about him, where you see his amazing office recreated there. You know, they called him a lot of different things. That ranged from being a communist to being a frontier justice to being Mr. Justice Pangloss. So he had sort of this cowboy mannerisms, and he has this big hat, goes to Washington, D.C., and I think people there might have wondered, you know, as we say out west, is this guy all hat and no cattle? Well, the truth was he was a true Westerner. There's no doubt about it. And so he was brought up here in Yakima and by a single mother. And we've heard about his bout with polio, which really brought him to the wilderness. And throughout his life, he made this connection between spirituality and nature. Mount Adams was his sanctuary. Now, his mother called him treasure, and her goal for him was to be president of the United States. We'll come back to that in a minute. So he goes off to Whitman College. He supposedly rides the rails to Columbia Law School. By then, he'd married a young teacher, Mildred, from here in Yakima. At Columbia Law School, he began what I think is his amazingly meteoric rise. Top grades, top everything. But you know what? He missed the brass ring. He did not get a clerkship on the U.S. Supreme Court. But amazingly, 14 years later, he's on the U.S. Supreme Court. So sometimes, you know, missing a few things is not so bad. So now before that happened, he went off to this big New York law firm called Cravath, Swaine & Moore. And he complained that it was very much drudgery being a law firm associate. So he decided, why not come back out to Washington State? And so he interviewed with my former law firm, Perkins Coie, and that firm offered him $600 a month. Well, Cravath couldn't stand that, so they offered him $5,000 a month. So you can guess where he went. Nothing changes. He went back to New York City. And it turned out the work was still as boring as when he started out there. So he didn't last long. He then became a law professor at Columbia and then Yale. That didn't last very long either. He's then on to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and he goes there under the tutelage of Joe Kennedy. But then he's there doing research on some projects, and not very long after that, he becomes an SEC commissioner. Okay. 1937, a couple years later, he's named chairman of the SEC. And that would never happen today, this kind of meteoric rise. But he was a very talented guy. 1939, President Roosevelt nominates him at only age 40 to replace Justice Brandeis. So he's the second youngest justice to serve ever, actually. And here's the Supreme Court in 1939. So now Roosevelt decided he wanted a Westerner on the U.S. Supreme Court. So although Douglas had spent his adult life on the East Coast, His brother and others kicked in, including the Yakima Bar Association, to say, he is a boy of the West. And that was music to Roosevelt's ears because, he was obviously looking for votes and looking to make his mark out West. So he calls in Douglas one day, and Douglas is very worried because he fears he's going to be named chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. And he said that would be dreadful. So he goes in there with some trepidation, and Roosevelt says, I'm going to appoint you to a job that's a little bit like going to jail. So that made him think, for sure, I'm going to be the head of the FCC. But guess what? He says, I want you to be on the United States Supreme Court. Now, put this in perspective. 2 days from his formal nomination to confirmation. Amazing. And his hearing lasted 5 minutes. So that is quite a contrast to what you see today. The thing about Douglas is he really was kind of a political animal. He loved hobnobbing in Washington, going to the embassy parties. Late at night, he's like playing poker with the president. And, he basically is kind of the political and social fabric of Washington, D.C. He just absorbs it all. On the first decade that he's on the bench, so we're talking 1939, 49, his political star continued to rise, which is a little unusual because he's on the U.S. Supreme Court. He is not a political candidate. But they keep mentioning him as a possible presidential nominee or vice presidential. And what happened was, in the end, when Roosevelt names his vice president, he names Truman. Douglas loses out. He claims, I'm not sorry about that. Of course he's sorry. He had rigged up a telephone via the Forest Service to be on call, just in case he got the call. So in the end, he loses out to Truman. And then the last push comes 1948. Truman asks him to be the vice president. So here's what rumor has it. Rumor has it he said, why be number 2 to a number 2? And he turned it down. So he said, politics are perishable, but the work of the court is long and enduring. But then really the time was, that's when he had his near-fatal horse accident out here. Not far from Mount Rainier. The horse is 1,600 pounds. They roll off the mountain, and the horse lands on him. 23 broken ribs. So that takes a while to recover from. And at that point, he really shifts his focus. He'd been on the court now for, 10 years? And he was a little bored. And to be honest, his marriage to the Yakima school teacher sweetheart was on the rocks. And it seemed like now he was not going to be president or vice president. So he writes the book that we've heard about, Of Men and Mountains. And that's what he does for his recovery, both his psychological recovery and then also kind of his professional recovery, like where am I going? And so he, at this point, I think, becomes an unapologetic enthusiast and an activist for the environment. So I want to tell you how I came to this title of my book, Citizen Justice, The Environmental Legacy of William O. Douglas. So early in his term, the court had this case, doesn't matter, O'Malley v. Woodruff. I do want to say that if you think this goes on a little long, it's because the Washington State Bar Association has very graciously granted us continuing legal education credit. So I have to say a few legal things in addition to political, environmental, and other things, so bear with me. Okay, here's the question in the lawsuit. Should federal judges have to pay federal income tax? Well, of course, I would say, hey, why? That would be fantastic. Well, the Supreme Court makes short work of that, and they say, no. Federal judges are like everybody else. They have to pay federal income taxes. So he later tells journalist Eric Severide that he made this little note in the docket. Young man, you just voted yourself first-class citizenship. and hence citizen justice. And he says, you know, I can do anything any of you can do as long as I don't interfere with what's going on with the court. So that's the conundrum we're going to talk about tonight. I want to explore whether his role as a citizen justice collided with the work of the court. Now, while he's on the court, and really during his life, he has two abiding principles. He believed that wilderness provided solitude, sanctuary, and spirituality, and that connected the individual to a larger environment and to a larger history than the individual. Wilderness needed to be saved. The second thing he believed, and that is that the Constitution was created to get the government off the backs of the people and to protect minority rights. So both of these themes really go into what Douglas became, both on the court and in the environment. So I'll talk first about what I call dissenting on the road. And he is a champion dissenter, so my themes are dissent, of course. He adored and followed his heroes. We've heard about some of them tonight: Thoreau, John Muir, Teddy Roosevelt. But his real devotion kind of showed up publicly on a hike on the C&O Canal, Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, Washington, D.C. You know, it's a wonderful thing when you can go to the Library of Congress and you can actually look at his calendar for the day of his hike. He's a total pack rat. He keeps everything, or he kept everything. And so you look in his calendar and it says, hike. That's all it says. But you know what? That hike changed his life and his trajectory. So in the 1950s, National Park Service says they want to build a parkway down the C&O Canal so people can get there easier. It's the age of the automobile. And the Washington Post wrote a big editorial, whoa, what a great idea. So Douglas, as a sitting justice, writes back a letter to the editor. Dear editors, this is a stupid idea. And I invite you to come with me for a hike on the C&O Canal so that you can see. And he often did that. He invited people, come down and see. Because we often have policymakers that are making policy and they haven't even seen the environment or the terrain. So here he is, amazing, hiking down the C&O Canal. So this hike takes 7 days, 189 miles, and only 9 people actually finished, including Olaus Murie. And that's where he meets Olaus Murie. And he's incredibly fast hiker. He's a tall guy. You know, he's tall, fit. He hikes 5 to 6 miles an hour. Well, that's astonishing if you think about it. So he arranged for the hike to end in Washington, D.C. so they could get some publicity. And guess what? In the end, the Washington Post editors wrote a new editorial and they revoked their support for the highway. So here's how he went about it. He embarked on lobbying efforts with the Department of Interior, and ultimately, it was never built. He formed a committee. You can guess who might have been the chair of that committee, William O. Douglas. In 1971, the canal became a National Historic Park. And this part I really love is in the National Park Service literature, this is the only park that is named after a single individual. I thought, how could that be? So I started clicking through all the parks I knew. This is the only park named after a single individual. And it's the only park that was walked into existence. So if you're in Georgetown, you'll see at the very beginning of the C&O Canal an amazing bust of Justice Douglas, and he and Cathy were there when that was inaugurated. So next, we move forward to Alaska. So the Muries said to him, well, we're very interested in saving the Arctic and saving Alaska. Do you want to come to Alaska? Now, they are not celebrity collectors, but they were very strategic because they knew what could be better than the support and the name of a U.S. Supreme Court justice. So there he is at a place called Last Lake, called that because it was the last lake they went to, and it hadn't been named. And when he got there, Marty Murray kept saying, Justice Douglas, Justice Douglas. He says, no, no, call me Bill. He became just a regular hiker. And then he wrote a chapter on the fragile Arctic in one of his 50 books called My Wilderness, the Pacific West. So that fight for the Arctic and to save the Arctic was long and difficult, and it became a political football. So the Murrays were out on the ground in Alaska trying to convince people, and they were not combative. They went to all kinds of individuals, people that would agree, people who would disagree. Douglas is back in Washington, D.C., greasing the skids with the Eisenhower people to see if they can't put that into protected status. You know, fast forward, Secretary Jewell mentioned the Antiquities Act. So Carter put it into the status under the Antiquities Act to save the Arctic. But he also knew that could be gone if there were a new president. And ultimately, in 1981, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act passed, and it really saved Alaska. But it was a compromise with timber, with oil, with conservationists, with the natives, with the native corporations. So that is Douglas, you know, at his best. There he was behind the scenes. So I'll show you one other one, and here he is on the Olympic beach. Any of you maybe have been out there to this beautiful beach on the Olympic, and guess what intervenes? A highway. They want to put a highway down the Olympic beach. Now, today we think, well, that really is a stupid idea. Why not put the highway behind the beach instead of on the beach? So Douglas, he's out there, and there he is. I want to give you just a flavor. You've seen a lot of pictures, but here he is. So I love that movie. But I will tell you, know, that's really him. You can see him marching down the beach, and he's got all these people following him down the beach, many of Washington's very well-known conservationists. So now I want to turn a different way, and that's what I call dissenting in the corridors of power. It's a different kind of advocacy, and it's really kind of remarkable because he undertook such extensive lobbying and correspondence on behalf of projects all over the country. He was what I call a one-man lobby shop. So I made up this little business card for him if he had decided he wanted to carry a business card. So here's his signature approach. He finds the threatened place. He then leverages local and national groups. He forms a committee. He's the chair of the committee. And then he begins to lobby federal agencies, the president, or whomever. So this is one really unusual justice. And you can hardly imagine anybody today, say Justice X, being in the same position as Justice Douglas. But you know, he had a close relationship with people in power. And so here he is with President Kennedy, very good friends with the Kennedys. And here's what he said to Jack Kennedy. He said, Jack, problem with you is you never slept on the ground. But nonetheless, President Kennedy did promote the environment. There he is with President Johnson, and he had kind of a funny relationship with Johnson. He was very close to him, but he didn't think he was the best conservationist. Well, President Johnson signed the Wilderness Act, and President Johnson helped save many other things and a lot of legislation. So now I want to say that Douglas was not shy about his views. He had what he called public enemies list. And he wrote in an article in Playboy, it's hard to pick out the number one enemy, but he did, and that was the Army Corps of Engineers, and that is the agency that is responsible for the dams. So you say to yourself, what is this Supreme Court justice doing writing for Playboy magazine? Well, I said he was an unusual justice, but he would tell you that's what men read, young men, and I want them to understand all of this. So, you know, when he was a little boy here in Yakima, he wanted to be a forester. He said, I want to grow up to be like Gifford Pinchot. Later, he puts them on his enemies list, and he says, no, no, Forest Service, all they do is cut, cut, cut. So they became, you know, one of his enemies. So let me give you a sample of how he goes about this. This is public enemy number one. This is the Red River Gorge in Kentucky. They want to build a flood control dam, legitimate, important thing. Sierra Club wants to oppose it. So they say, well, how could we get this accomplished? Let's invite Justice Douglas down from Washington, which they do. So they invite him down from Washington. And they said, you know, we don't think we would have gotten this dam stopped if we hadn't invited him. Now, on this particular hike, journalist Diane Sawyer covered that for TV media. She was a young journalist. He came with his new wife, you know, Cathy. She was just 23 when they married. He was 67. And that was like rocked the social scene in somewhat conservative Washington, D.C. But I want to say that, you know, as far as the environmentalists and others, they weren't fazed at all by that because they were looking at what he was doing for them. And as we know, and you saw in this amazing video from Cathy, you know, she went on to law school. She became a very well-known environmental lawyer and is now not only an environmental lawyer, but is a philanthropist in really around the country. So she too became an advocate for the environment, and she did it in a different way. But each of them was really unique in how they went about it. Now the press said that Douglas was driven out of town by a bunch of armed men. They didn't want a senile justice telling them what to do. Well, they were talking about that in the newspaper. What's he doing? He's writing a note to President Johnson, basically saying, you know, maybe you ought to stop this project and we should study it. And we all know you study anything, it'll take forever, it'll never happen. And that's a good recipe for stopping things. So he got LBJ involved, and then he got his very good friend, Stuart Udall. And I can guarantee you, he and Stuart Udall had an amazing partnership. And were he alive when Secretary Jewell was Secretary of Interior, he would have had that same amazing partnership with her. So project after project he worked with Udall on. And you may remember, maybe not, my opening slide is a picture of the Snake River painted by Thomas Moran of the Hudson River School. And conservationists fought a dam there for years. And finally it came in front of the Supreme Court. Udall, as Secretary of Interior, intervened in the Supreme Court saying that it was a problem to have this dam. And Douglas wrote the majority, he doesn't want to say majority opinion, first time they had stopped a dam. And they sent it back to the agency, just take another look at that. So next day, Udall sends him this note about his opinion. It's a conservation landmark, and it was. So before I leave this subject of Douglas and all of his corridors of power, let me just touch briefly on his writings. 50 books, he's an incredibly fast writer, incredibly prolific. So he's not only writing for Playboy, but for Ladies' Home Journal, Living Wilderness, Red Book, a Saturday Evening Post, Nat Geo, National Enquirer. He wanted to reach the people. And that's when people read magazines. And guess what? That's when they actually even paid you to write articles for magazines, which nobody does anymore. And he got a little extra money for alimony and whatever else he might have needed it for. I didn't look into his personal finances, okay? So I just want to say, you know, he spoke to America in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s as conservation and the environment are really coming of age. So he really helped ignite this conscience. Now let's talk about him on the Supreme Court. Washington State Bar, one more segment on the law. So just make sure that all the lawyers get their credit. You know, he was this sickly little kid, and he always wanted approbation as a kid. But by the time he takes his seat on the court, he's really quite confident, a kind of confidence that had turned him into a champion dissenter. When he had retired, he dissented in 486 opinions. And you might think, well, I don't know what that means. Well, we often think of Justice Scalia as a big dissenter. And although he was on the court just a little bit less, he only dissented 254 times. But most importantly, when Douglas dissented, in 40% of those times, he was the only person dissenting on the court. And what he said often was, he didn't need to jawbone with people. The only soul he had to save was his own. Now, he was an amazing workhorse, and that's an incredibly admirable trait. He said this work of the court only takes 3 to 4 days a week. Well, you know, I don't think his other justices kind of thought that was the case. So what would happen is he would finish his dissent. He said, I'm done. And the Supreme Court always issues its opinions by June 30. Well, before June 30, he was on the plane to Goose Prairie. So that didn't really endear him completely with the people on the court. So he really was a chief dissenter, and in my view, that's an extension of who he was. He was an individualist. In many ways, he was a loner, and he was a nonconformist. So he said one time about hiking, how lonely had been the trail I walked. He might have been talking about his time at the Supreme Court, because there were a lot of parallels with that. Now, this year, 2022, is the 50th anniversary of a case called Sierra Club v. Morton, and that his most famous dissent. So I want to talk briefly about that. Here we are, this is Mineral King Valley in California, 12 miles of a glacial valley, and in the 60s, a big challenge. The Forest Service gave Walt Disney Productions a permit to develop this as a ski resort. That's what it would have looked like had they gone ahead. So the Sierra Club was, of course, quite upset with this, and they decided to go to district court and oppose it. The district court said, that's right, stop Disney. Then it went to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit disagreed, and then they appealed to the US Supreme Court. Now, interestingly, this case comes to the court as Sierra Club v. Morton, and Douglas is no stranger to the Sierra Club. He had actually been on the board, but he got a little bored with being on the board, so he had resigned, actually. And he then became a lifetime member. So long about December of 1970, when ostensibly out of the blue, he writes this letter to the Sierra Club. He basically says, oh, maybe I should resign, because there might be a case, although I don't know of any case, even though it was all over the newspapers, coming the way of the Supreme Court. So he resigns, and he sits on the case, which was a lot of controversy. You see that in the papers of the other justices as well. But he felt at this point he had made a decision. And Cathy has said that as time went on, he was more and more cautious about these potential conflicts of interest with his outside interests. So here's the big question in this case. Not first, will we build this resort, but is the Sierra Club the right party to bring the lawsuit? Do they have what we call legally standing? And the Sierra Club decided to roll the dice. Normally to get standing, you say, I have a lot of my members. They like to hike there. They're going to be impacted. I have people who maybe have in-holdings that area. They're going to be impacted. No, the Sierra Club did something completely novel. They didn't say there was any injury to the Sierra Club. They said it was to Mineral King itself. Well, ultimately, the Ninth Circuit was affirmed, and we often like that when the Supreme Court decides to affirm the Ninth Circuit, of course. But Potter Stewart said no standing, because you haven't shown that anybody was injured. Douglas, soon after the argument, in a matter of hours, writes this eloquent dissent, which I think really, he said it should have been called not Sierra Club v. Morton, Secretary of Interior, but it should have been called Mineral King, the Valley, versus the Secretary of Interior. So here's his dissent, which is now really one of the most iconic dissents that we ever see. And he talks about valleys and alpine meadows, rivers, lakes. The voice of these environmental wonders should be heard. I'm not going to get into all the details tonight. I guess you buy the book or not. But how did this come to be? Well, there was a professor out at University of Southern California Law School who said, maybe nature should have standing. Maybe nature can sue. And one of Douglas's clerks got this bootleg to him, this article, which wasn't quite done, and he puts it on the justice's desk. And the justice says, well, this is fantastic. And it does echo many of his views. But he wanted to get the whole law review article ASAP. And so there's a lot of correspondence back and forth, and he finally gets this. Now, keep in mind, no other justice gets this law review article that gives these ideas. But, you know, all of this really drew together who Douglas was. He communed with trees, rivers, and valleys. So in the end, the Sierra Club wasn't able to bring the suit in the name of Mineral King. But they went back and they found some members. And eventually, Walt Disney, who actually also had been a member of the Sierra Club, the Walt Disney Corporation actually dropped that. So we have this idea of nature's rights. And, you know, it stands for this notion that inanimate objects isn't just an academic exercise, but it's had some traction over time, but not particularly in the United States. We've had a few ordinances or zoning laws, where they've awarded standing to natural objects like a river. But it really took off internationally. And so you see nature's rights in constitutions in Ecuador, Colombia, Uganda, Bangladesh. And in New Zealand concluded a compact with the Maoris in which there was a river and a mountain recognized. So he didn't sort of win the battle, lose the war. I would say he lost the war but won the battle. And that is, there was not any futility in pushing this idea because it has come to fruition. And we have decades and decades to come to see, you know, where the law might develop. So let me bring Douglas back home. Here he is, and I call this dissenting in his own backyard. So sometimes he's called Wild Bill, but I think they should call him Wilderness Bill. And the reason is he worked so hard on the '64 Wilderness Act and ultimately behind the scenes for what came the 1984 Wilderness Act. So there you have his cabin at Goose Prairie, and some of us had a chance to go up there today. I'll divert briefly and tell you a story. When I got out of law school, Douglas was still alive, and then he died. And he was a hero to so many people. So some lawyers in Seattle called us together, and they said, you know what? We should buy this cabin in Goose Prairie and make it like a museum or some kind of sanctuary. So really, it was a great idea. There's just two problems with that. One, we're brand new lawyers. We have no money, okay? That's number one. But two, it's not for sale. So, okay, it's not for sale. Fast forward about 5 years ago, my former partners, Val Hughes and Mike Hoagie, purchased this cabin. And they are preserving it really as a museum, or at least, you know, really as to what Douglas imagined it be, one of his sanctuaries. You also see up there on the right, Douglas with the Double K girls. And for that photo, I have to thank Ed Kershaw, who I tracked down, and he was gracious enough to give me that photo. You know, they live next door, basically, to the Douglas cabin. And for years, Douglas and the Double K girls were relentless in saying, we need a wilderness out in this area. And they lobbied, they wrote letters. The Forest Service called the Double K girls the Blister Sisters, because believe me, those letters are blistering when they are writing to the Forest Service. And it was really an amazing partnership that they had, along with Washington senators, particularly Scoop Jackson and others. And so, at the very end, after Douglas died, 1984, Wilderness Act creates the William O. Douglas Wilderness. And we now have what's called the PNWADS, the Pacific Northwest William O. Douglas Society. And I thank all of them because they were so gracious in providing photos, information, others down at the museum, because so much of this really needs to be preserved. And there's a beautiful picture out at Goose Prairie of Justice Douglas and Cathy. There, of course, is the iconic Mount Rainier, a view from the William O. Douglas Wilderness. So in closing, I want to say that I certainly viewed Douglas as an imperfect hero. By all accounts, he could be difficult, and according to some law clerks, he was a tyrant at times. He thought one law clerk had written in a book, so he takes the book and he throws it out the Supreme Court window, and luckily it didn't, you know, those are heavy, those law books, didn't land and kill somebody out there, and nobody was injured. But you know, he also has an astonishing legacy in the law, in the environment, and in the lives of those who knew him. Many of the clerks remember fondly him as a mentor, having a drink with him on a Friday night, going on the C&O Canal with him. Those in the conservation movement really treated him with reverence. It was like he had a life in Washington, D.C., and a life in the wilderness. He was a justice on a mission. Here's what he once told a law clerk. He says, "Get out in the stream of history and swim as fast as you can." That's what he did. He got out in the stream of history, and he was still swimming at the time he died. He also, though, teaches us the hazards and the value of being a contrarian and also being a dissenter. So finally, I want to say his conservation legacy cannot be overstated. There's little doubt that his commitment and connection to the land had an enormous impact on the landscape. Literally, scores of projects across the country have been preserved because of him. And most importantly, you know, he laid the groundwork for our present-day conversation about the environment. The word environment wasn't even used in the Supreme Court as we think of it today until 1970. And you can imagine who used it. It was Justice Douglas. When he left the court, he analogized it to going on a canoe trip with the justices. He says, at the beginning we were strangers, but at the end we're fast friends. But importantly, here's what he said. He hoped that they would leave these wildernesses and these watercourses as pure and unpolluted as we left those which we traversed. To his law clerks, he says, keep the faith in the rule of law. And his legacy, he wanted to be remembered as someone who made the earth more beautiful than when he came. And he truly did. Thank you for letting me share some of William O. Douglas's legacy with you.